My name's Aeron Corrino, here in lovely Untitled. Been playing in the society since about 2000 to 2001, give or take. I was a little bit of a Christmas and Easter player only at Penzic before I moved out here. I went to college for theater design and focused largely on period productions. And in particular, I fell in love with Shakespeare. So I've worked on a number of Shakespeare productions, both period depictions as well as modern dress, artsy interpretations thereof, and can see the merits in all of them, but I have my preferences. And it was in looking into a lot of how theater was produced and how it was presented in the SCA timeline that made me curious about the SCA in the first place. We all were taught a number of truths about what Shakespeare's theater was and wasn't. And we are presented a lot of them now as fact, which, as I've discovered while working on these, really isn't the case. And it made me think about what they did and how they did it in a very different way. And clothing in general, particularly for us in the SCA. So in calling this class All the World is a Stage, yes, I am going to focus pretty predominantly on Shakespeare. But for us in the SCA, I think it still has relevance because every time that we get together as a large group, as a kingdom, whether it's here in Ontario or any other kingdom, it is to celebrate a large event. We're having a tournament. We are having a coronation. We are having a step down, an anniversary of the kingdom, an anniversary of the barony. The king and queen don't show up because it's dinner on Tuesday, where it is a state occasion, it is a special occasion. And throughout the SCA timeline, when the king and queen were showing up and it's a state occasion, you put on your good stuff. And often there was a festival and specific attire and fantasy play involved that gave the populace license to kind of break the rules a little bit and not do the everyday norm. And I think we should feel empowered to do a lot more of that when we have our kingdom events. We think of sci-fi conventions, fantasy conventions, fiction conventions, costume college, Ren fairs as other than us because that's not truly period, because they're being fantastical. All throughout history, people have dressed up in costume, in special occasion clothing, to be someone or something other than what they are. In some cases, it was as minimal as weaving a wreath of flowers to put in their hair and singing and dancing in a field. In other occasions, it's an entire outfit with a mask and a created persona that they would be for a week, 2 weeks, until actual 12th night, or until Carnival, Lent began, rather. But there has always been a practice of putting on a costume, putting on a false persona that was, to some degree, based in fantasy. And I think we should embrace that more in what we do in the SCA, or make space for it. If it's not your thing, yay, that's fine. But I think we should make space for the fact that it did happen and it has a place within the SCA right alongside and just as valid as what did Sir Bob wear on a daily basis when he was going out into his community to collect taxes from his tenants. That's an interesting set of clothing as well, but it's a different clothing for a different purpose. But no less interesting a commentary on what Sir Bob is as a person, as the mask and the costume that he put on during the 12 days of Christmas leading up to 12th night, where he got to pretend to be someone else and maybe get away with a little bit when everyone was looking the other way and pretending they didn't know who he was behind that mask. Fantasy and fictive clothing play has existed and been a part of society right alongside our everyday and our church clothes. So I think it says something very interesting about each of the cultures that it appears in, how they chose to interpret it. You can look at Germany's version of Carnival in Venice, where there are a number of illustrations of the truly insane costumes that they came up with. And not only that, they made floats out of, they would take boats, put wheels on wagon, put them on a wagon and decorate them and pull them through the town in a parade. So even right down to like Tournament of Roses parade we have now, they were doing that then. There was the gondola, repeated gondola parades in Venice throughout Carnival and almost any celebratory occasion that the state of Venice would have. There was a gondola parade, and the gondolas were decorated and people were wearing some sort of ceremonial clothing or costume for that. You see the beginnings of the formation of the ballet in late 1590s to early 1600s France in their court, and the very, very weird stylized costumes that were created there, as well as the Commedia dell'arte coming out of Italy with their stock characters, the maid, the trickster, the misanthrope, the fool, with their very sort of Greek tragedy, comedy, stylized masks and very set costumes that went with them. Ultimately, all of these existed side by side and were talked of in other countries, but nobody really took it to quite the height of convolution as the English. Witness the Shakespeare characters. Now, I will say the reason I'm doing them and the reason they're as stylized as they are is for a specific event that's going to happen at Pennsic. And we're merging the game Clue and Shakespeare characters. So each of the characters is going to be monochromatic like the characters from Clue. Vaulting over that and just dealing with how I wanted to approach designing them, I wanted them to all look like something you might see as the characters were presented their first time on Shakespeare's stage in the Globe, which meant a lot of digging into how did they present theater? How did they present spectacle? And it involved a bit of rabbit hole digging into other aspects of theater than just the costuming. Turns out there isn't a whole heck of a lot that survives. Not surprisingly, certainly costume-wise. We don't have any extant theater costumes. There are some renderings of costume designs that Inigo Jones, who I'll touch on a little bit more later, did, not for Shakespeare plays, but for plays at the same time that Shakespeare's work was being presented. So you can get a sense of what sort of stylization they were using to present costume characters or personas, whether they were for court masques, you know, a themed party, or an actual on-stage drama. Essentially, a couple of things to note about drama and plays on the Globe stage that are different than what we think of. One, time was a big factor. You will, if you go back to reread Romeo and Juliet, there is a reference in the prologue where the chorus that is introducing everything notes that the play is going to be some 2 hours traffic. Everyone assumes that that's just sort of an offhanded reference to possible amount of time. However, there is an actual formula. About every 1,000 lines of text at a normal rate of speed, like I am talking now, should represent an hour of stage time. On average, most of Shakespeare's plays, if you use that formula, would clock in at somewhere around 2.5 to 3 hours and 15 minutes. Theater workers and performers were possibly one of the lowest rungs on the social ladder. They were pretty much level pegging with prostitutes and pimps socially, and the administration of London tried to do everything it could to discourage playhouses from being able to encroach inside the city proper. There is still an old remnant of the wall that designated London proper at the time when Elizabeth was on the throne. And the Globe Theatre, the Rose, the Bear Pit, and a few others all existed on the other side of the river, still part of what was metropolitan London, but not inside the city proper. They very consciously forced the theaters to move over into what was called the stews, the area where the bars, the taverns, and the whorehouses were. But they also very stringently regulated them, and one of the big regulations that they put on them was time. If your play ran over 2 hours long, you could be fined heftily, and if they really felt like cracking down on you, they could close your theater for whatever period of time they felt like. So every time you're seeing a Shakespeare play now, and actors are allowed to be actory, pause and be very dramatic and think and pace a scene slowly, would not have happened in period. They were spitting out lines of dialogue, top speed. So think about your average Shakespeare play, the number of characters that are in that play, and the density of the dialogue, and how much linguistic subtext is going on there. Even for someone who spoke that version of the language, that version of English, it's in iambic pentameter, which is not how they talked. It's a poetic construct. So you have an audience, largely illiterate, who paid to see a show, and you've got to keep them engaged, you've got to keep them involved, while you're throwing a ton of characters at them in very short order, and you've got no set. You tell the audience where the play is happening, but there's no visual. We think of plays now when we go to the theater, and you're going to get, potentially, to some degree or another, a constructed, designed, conceived setting that all the characters are going to interact with you through the framework of. It's going to contextualize how you view them and help support whatever version of reality they're portraying. That did not exist in the Globe. They may have had a bench or a hand prop, a dagger, a knife, something that they could carry in with them and carry off. But if you're doing something at high speed, the concept of having a set that might need to be changed or manipulated from one scene to the next was impossible. They were dealing with too many high-speed variables to factor in something like that. You don't see setting become part of the spectacle until well after Shakespeare's lifetime. So take, for instance, Cleopatra, this piece here. She dominates a huge amount of the play. And your average Elizabethan citizen who might be functionally literate enough to sign their own name, possibly write out a list of items, or recognize a store sign or a tavern sign, but they have never read the classics for the most part. They certainly do not know the story of all of these classical figures that Shakespeare is often basing his characters on. So Shakespeare's got to do the work of creating both a sense of place and a sense of person. And the only thing he's got to work with is the body of the actor and their voice. Those are really pretty important things to figure in, because if you had to try and convince an audience to pay attention to you and believe you as Cleopatra for 2 hours, that's a tall order for even the most gifted actor. Another thing to remember is one of the other sort of mistruths that we are taught about Shakespeare, in that it was illegal for women to act on stage in Elizabethan England. That was not actually the case. Yes, all the female parts were played by men, but it was not because of a matter of law. There was never a law on the books that said a woman could not act on stage. That was a convention that the theater owners adopted for a very specific reason. They wanted to basically be made into a guild, like the Metalsmiths Guild, like the Limners Guild, like the Jewelers Guild, all of the other guilds that had a lot of very specific economic protections, and because of their guild status, pricing guarantees that they could ensure, and a legitimacy. There was a social stature associated with being a guild. And it would have definitely made it possible for them to start trying to move into the city proper and into more respectable circles if they could establish themselves as a guild. But here's the thing, all of the guilds were male dominated. There was no guild that would admit a woman into its membership. So if the theater owners wished to be recognized as an official guild, they had to start behaving like one of the official guilds and demonstrate that they had the organization and the membership equal to any of the others if they wanted that recognition. So they did not admit women onto the stage in London. Everywhere else in England, there were women on stage. Everywhere else in Europe, women on stage. It was a very common convention. But that's an important thing that the London theater owners had to combat, because you had people who at a country fair could see a traveling play and there'd be women playing the women's roles, and they look like women and they sound like women and they're believably women. You don't question it. But all of a sudden you come into London and you're expecting your audience to pay, and in some cases, in a large proportion of the audience, not only pay to watch the show, pay to stand down in the groundling section for 2 hours to watch your show, and you're going to make them accept a male dressed as a woman pretending to be a woman. Okay, that's a lot to take on right there. And then you're going to hamstring it even further. Well, if we want them to be women, they need to be believable, so they would go and get boys. Your average female role on a Shakespeare play was first premiered by anywhere between a 15-year-old up to about a 19, maybe 20-year-old. But that was about the tipping point where they would attrition out of being able to believably play the female roles and would be segued into playing the male roles then. Now in modern day, you know, Cleopatra, for a modern actress, playing Cleopatra is a challenge. She's on stage for a good 2/3 to 3/4 of the play. She drives the plot. She has a lot of agency in her own choices, much more so than other female characters in Shakespeare plays. She has to be very compelling, and yet she was played by a 15 or 16-year-old kid the first time out, who was having to rattle off lines at high speed, move about the stage very quickly, and keep the attention of an audience that were nowhere near as quiet and complacent as our modern audiences were. They were interactive. They would holler, they would ooh, they would ah. They were not staid, quiet audiences. They routinely, what you don't hear about when you're reading a Shakespeare play is they would also employ clowns who would be, I don't want to say acting, they would be pantomiming things that either supported or contrasted what was being said by the main actors on stage. They were off on the sides. Basically, they were hedging the bet and keeping if the audience was getting a little bit disengaged because the dialogue was too wordy, oh, hey, look, there's a clown being silly to make the audience laugh and get past that boring part that would then later have to be recalibrated. So you have a 15-year-old who's having to carry all of this weight, performance-wise, and has to believably be this monumental character as much as possible. That's a tall order. Looking at what we depict now as a Shakespeare play, if you watch, and there's a number of Globe Theatre productions that have been put online during the pandemic, where they do amazing recreations of period clothing. And you see a play acted out, and in some cases they're actually casting men in the women's roles to move that much of a step closer to how it was presented. They're not using kids, but they are at least putting men in the roles, so they're a step closer. But the thing that I noticed in watching those productions that made me a little bit sketchy is that they were in what we would think of as true street clothes. If you look at genre paintings from the period that depict marketplaces and large group settings at court, the clothing that you are seeing on stage looks very similar to the clothing that you are seeing in those paintings depicting everyday life within the period. I seriously doubt you would have an audience willing to pay money to watch a show that they're going to have to stand for 2 hours to watch while a 15-year-old boy pretends to be a woman when they can go right outside of town and see the same play produced by a different company with an actual woman playing the role. I don't think you're going to make them buy into that many suspensions of disbelief unless you're giving them some amount of visual spectacle that makes them want to engage, that makes them want to stay involved. So to us, looking at a Globe Theatre production now, seeing someone run around in accurate, everyday Elizabethan clothing looks theatrical. It is spectacle because that method of dress is very different than how we dress now. But if you got the average fishmonger or carpenter in that theater looking at those people, he would see nothing that he couldn't just walk right out into the marketplace and see on someone else right out there. It's not special. It is not captivating of his attention. And also, it doesn't help tell the story. Looking at all of the hurdles that the actors and the writer, Shakespeare, would have to overcome in keeping his audience's attention, one of the things that to me seemed really important is that whatever those characters walk out on stage wearing has to do a lot more work of telling the story of who they are and how they fit into the cast of characters, and how the audience is to expect them to relate to one another. Because there is no set, there are minimal props, so it's just the voice coming out of the actor's mouth and then whatever they're wearing that are going to establish place and person. And so in looking at it from that perspective, I decided that I needed to pack as much detail into what these looked like. These are my interpretation. They are a bit of a flight of fancy. I looked at, as I mentioned earlier, representations of Inigo Jones' costume designs for masques and theater. Inigo Jones was British born early on, like 1590s, I believe it was, to early 1600. He was shipped off to Italy because he had demonstrated a high proficiency at, it was called draftsmanship, but essentially he was very good at drawing, very realistic renderings. And there was a school at the time in Italy that he was sent to. They're not quite sure which lord was the official paying patron who sent him, but he was sent to study there because his style was very similar to that of the Italian school. Shortly after completing his training there, he was dispatched to the court of Denmark, where he became an advisor to Christian of Denmark. And was it Christian? Yes, let me double check that, because there's a whole bunch of names. Inigo. But he was helping with the design of several palaces that were being built there. And at the same time, this is essentially about the same time that Elizabeth was in her last days. And when Elizabeth died and James made his way down to England, Inigo Jones was sent by the King of Denmark to join Anne of Denmark's household, King James's wife. She became his patron, and it was under her patronage when he was there in London that he began doing a lot of his theater design work. He worked predominantly with the playwright Ben Jonson, but he also did do a bit of work with the playwrights Beaumont and Fletcher, who were also compatriots of Shakespeare's. Beaumont, Fletcher, and Jonson were essentially the masterpiece theater of their time. Shakespeare was essentially the Keeping Up with the Kardashians of the time. He was viewed as lowest common denominator. He enjoyed more success at court through James than he did under Elizabeth. If you look at most of the plays that Shakespeare wrote early on, there is a high propensity of bloodbath early on in the play, huge body count, and the stickier, more complicated topics start getting dealt with in his mid to later career, when he was braver about making political and social commentary. But Inigo Jones created a lot of very fantastical, whimsical costume designs. I will provide, there are some of them in the presentation that Mr. Stisa has provided the link to in here. And if you tool through them, you'll see, you can clearly tell the period that they are executed in, but they bear absolutely no relation whatsoever to anything realistic. and are really more akin to stuff that you would see at Dragon Con or Emerald City Comic Con. They have that fantasy whimsy element to them that is just ridiculously over the top. And looking at how far over the top they felt empowered, or the need to go to create a character that would immediately give you a sense of who and what they were, that to me meant pack in the detail like crazy. Go overboard. Do not hesitate to compose every square inch of visible fabric that the characters are going to wear, because every little bit of that is helping tell the story that you are trying to get across to your audience. For me, it's about performance. Within an SCA context, though, I would kind of point to the quote-unquote NASCAR dress, because that one was intended more as special occasion wear. I'm going to stand up and you'll hear me. My head might be out of shot for a little bit, so I can let you look. This one is Titania, and she very definitely is going to lean a little bit toward East Indian influences. This, the NASCAR outfit that I made, jokingly, NASCAR outfit, it's actually my heraldry exploded into a deconstructed form. You can kind of see the design elements, the rose and the sunburst. And then Cleopatra, who you have the big write-up of that you're looking at, she largely references the rainbow portrait of Elizabeth. And so I was looking at the shape, the scale, and a lot of the detailing that's in that portrait when composing how I wanted to create her. I did not try and do a direct recreation, because there's a lot of speculation that the dress depicted in that portrait, as it's depicted, did not exist, that it is an artist's fancy to tell an allegorical story in the form of a painting, rather than something that she actually stood there and had her likeness taken in. This piece, I'll talk about this in a minute, and we will do a question and answer very shortly. But ultimately, I felt like if I wanted to try and use the spirit of how they must have been approaching character portrayal, I needed to treat each character like they were a walking play in and of themselves, that everything that they were wearing helped tell the story, so that no matter what was going on, if Jane, who is down in the groundlings, gets a little bit bored of the dialogue, she can still be transfixed and fascinated and focused on all of the detail that keeps her riveted in what's going on stage, because the texts are very dense and they require a lot of even an educated reader, and most of his audience was not educated. So you have to find the bridge that allows that uneducated audience to find their way into the play and the group of characters that you're presenting. And absent the words, it's got to be a visual, because those are the only two things that the audience has to consume while they're part of that audience. These are a mix of period appropriate and not period appropriate fabrics. Mainly, I made that choice based on color saturation. I wanted all of the Shakespeare outfits to have a uniform level of color saturation, and so I looked at what things were available, what fabrics were available in a broad range of colors, so that I could do each of the different characters in a very saturated color. And it came down to good old-fashioned cotton broadcloth, which had the advantage of being also rather inexpensive. And when you're doing 14 or so different Shakespeare characters, that can get a little spendy. So I was happy that I found an alternative that allowed me uniform color saturation. So when they're all grouped together, there isn't going to be a faded out or less intense one. They'll all have the same level of visual intensity. But I think for you and I here in the SCA, how to take some of these things that I've been talking about and put them into practice is to think about what story you want your clothing to tell about the persona that you are creating within the SCA. In every portrait that you look at, the person is not standing there simply because in that outfit simply because, oh, I think this looks neat on me. It tells a very specific story about themselves. The colors have significance. If they're holding a flower, I absolutely guarantee you that flower has an allegorical symbolism, either social, religious, or political. Every little detail is a chosen detail. It's composed. And so it is helping to tell a story, and we can use that same approach when we're creating the clothes that we wear, particularly to our special events, because we're putting our best foot and our best face forward at those moments when we come together as a kingdom to celebrate a coronation, a tournament, a festival, an anniversary. You know, like I said, it's not dinner on a Tuesday where you wear your old house dress. You're putting on your best face forward. You're composing a story about yourself. And so I always encourage people to think about, and I know a lot of people don't want to bring politics and religion into the SCA, but the politics that your persona would likely have had. Where did they live? What religious persuasion were they of? Was that the dominant religion in their time, in their place? Or were they part of a marginal group? Because how they dressed and how they presented themselves and the details that they would choose to put on themselves, either to transmit that truth or to hide it and make you think they are something else, would have been very significant. And I think there are ways that we can enrich the visual that we present of ourselves when we are going to an event, that other people, if they are, other geeks will notice them eventually, and they're going to feel a sense of kinship because they can spot, oh, I know what that means, or I know that that color of blue from someone in that region has a social or a religious significance, and they can have a conversation with you then on why you chose to incorporate that one and what does it mean to your persona. I am not saying we have to flag our own personal beliefs, but it's a way of deepening our approach to the personas that we present by letting more aspects of their truth in the time frame influence how we dress that persona when we inhabit it and come to an event. The NASCAR outfit came about a little bit as a direct response to another project I had done. This one isn't, I would ask you, but we're gonna do the question and answer later, so I'll tell you. I'd ask you what you thought this cost, but I'll tell you, this whole outfit here only cost $107.52. And that's gold cording, and these are painted motifs, but it's all cotton broadcloth. And I purposely want to have this here after having this whole talk about how we can pack detail into how we present ourselves, to say that it doesn't also have to cost a ton of money to do that. I will absolutely guarantee you, every one of you who is watching this and every one of you who may watch this later on has made a starter tunic and a starter pair of big floofy pants for your first time in the SCA, made out of that $4 a yard or less cotton broadcloth from Walmart or Joann's. I purposely wanted to use that to demonstrate that you can still do something really visually stunning without having to spend a ton of money to do it. This is all this is proof that I had the willingness to win a grudge match with patience, because yes, it was time consuming to do, but I decided what level of complexity I wanted to build into it. But if you can sew a straight line, you can do this. If you can trace a pattern with a light desk and then paint in the lines, you can do this. If you can hold a needle and thread and just follow along a line, you can do this cording. It takes a little practice, but there's none of this in here that is a super, super complicated process. It is definitely approachable for a very new person to the SCA. So if you are dreaming of that really showy, detail-packed look that is rich with storytelling detail, don't let the end result intimidate you from taking the first step and actually doing it, because it is very definitely a doable thing. And anyone who has specific mechanical questions about sewing, I'm happy to answer those. But I will tell you, other than joining all of the squares together, this doublet on the NASCAR outfit is actually 4 pieces. The skirt, once I actually joined all of the squares to make the yardage, it's basically just a big rectangle that got pleated down to fit a waistband. There's no weird patterning or shaping to it. It is the simplest thing ever. It is merely a matter of deciding you have the patience to want to pursue something this detail oriented or less, whatever, you know, whatever methodology you choose, but don't let the complexity be what stops you from trying to tackle creating a bold visual statement about who your persona is, what they represent, and what they want to, how they would want to have been perceived in their culture at the time that they existed, because it is really not as difficult as some people would believe when looking at other people's end result. And I really want to encourage people to try and take that leap off of the diving board. I'm going to open it up to questions now. So I believe Mr. Stisa is going to have you type your questions in and then she'll relay them to me. But I'm happy to take as many questions as y'all want to throw out and ask away. It can be about the specific dresses or about the presentation. I'm happy to go with whatever you're curious about.
While we're waiting for any questions, can I just ask you, how long did it take you to make each of those dresses?
Well, Cleopatra isn't quite done yet, but I would say we're talking about in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 weeks if you actually crunched all the time together and counted it up. That is a lot more than my average, basically because there is no part of this that doesn't have fiddly detail packed into it. And it was basically a response to being in quarantine. I suddenly had a whole ton of time I wasn't anticipating having at my disposal. And so I didn't shy away from putting a whole lot more detail in than I might otherwise have done. NASCAR outfit, that one took, I would say, about a week and a half, 2 weeks. Mostly the slowdown factor was painting, tracing and painting all of the sunbursts. That was the slowest part. Once those were done, the joining of the squares went very quickly, and so it shot together pretty fast. Titania, again, not completed yet, but most of the major construction is done. She actually went together probably the fastest of these, but she doesn't have a lot of the busy detail that Cleopatra is going to have. But I would say this took maybe about a total of a week of working, 4 or 5 hours an evening here and there. So that's kind of they're arranged sort of longest to shortest amount of time spent, though, Titania is going to end up getting revised by the time she's fully complete.
So we've got a few questions here. Do you believe that the lack of extant evidence and written resources is due to the fact that the theaters were seen as such lowly things?
Possibly. One of the reasons why we have so little evidence is because we think of playwriting in a the writing process in general very differently now. Writers write for posterity. They write to be published. Shakespeare every play he wrote was a specific creation responding to what was going on in society. And he was writing it with the next season in mind when it was going to be performed. And I would argue he must have known who the actors were going to be that would be portraying particularly his female characters, because there is no consistency from one play to the next how much stage time and how much character strength is given to the female roles. So he must have known that Bob was going to be available next season because of the other plays they'd be doing, and Bob's really strong at portraying really gutsy female parts. So I'm going to write it for the new play we're adding in. I'm going to write a really strong female part. But when he got done writing that copy of the play, that was the one and only full copy. He then there were working copies that were given to each actor, but those only covered the exact words that each actor needed to memorize and a little bit of context before and after, so that the actor would know what was coming immediately before and after their speeches. So Shakespeare's works were not published until after his death, and it was Ben Jonson and a few other writers who gathered the working copies together that were left over by the actors and sort of came up with the best version that they could of what those plays were. There was also a fire that destroyed the Globe Theatre, so a number of the original working copies were lost. There are, I believe, 5 or 6 Shakespeare plays that they know existed that we just have no record of, because no working copies survived, but there are anecdotal references to them. So partially, yes, I think the fact that theater players were regarded so poorly did contribute, but whether or not society valued them, they knew they had a money-making commodity. So they did try and take pains to save what they could of what existed. It's just the process was very different then in terms of how a playwright would give the work to the acting company. So there weren't 20 or 30 full extant copies floating around of each play right after he wrote it. Certainly the cost of the costuming, that didn't survive, largely because actors were responsible for their own clothing. There was not a costume designer throughout most of Shakespeare's plays. They were, Inigo Jones was working with Ben Jonson on the more societally accepted and respected drama works. And so there would have been more money given to the production and presentation of those. Shakespeare, the actors were responsible for their own costumes. And so they were having to come up with how they were going to grab the audience's attention and how they were going to interpret that character, but it was with whatever they could afford. So yeah, it was being built out, cobbled together out of secondhand pieces. Some of the actors had patrons, and so if their patron happened to be a little bit more wealthy, they might have had access to either hand-me-downs from that patron, which would mean certainly a more approaching noble class of clothing, but they were getting put through a lot of use, and there was no hope that they were going to survive very long term, because it was clothing that had already gone through a single use as a first run garment that then had to be overhauled and turned into something that worked for the theater. So I think it was probably a combination of both how the theater functioned and how society viewed theater people that contributed to the fact that so little exists now of what they did then.
All right, let's see. How could I use this approach and apply it to the late 1400s in Italy, specifically Florence? There doesn't seem to be any visual reference for me to use, but there are written records of ballets with Antica type costumes, allegories, classical characters, and themes.
The thing to look up there, particularly in Italy, look up Commedia, Commedia, Del, Del, art, A-R-T-E. They were sort of the early forerunner to what would become Punch and Judy in England, but they had a bunch of stock characters that everyone in Italian society would recognize, because there were companies that would travel all throughout Italy and perform these stock plays, and they were usually very predictable plays about a husband being duped by a wife who's stepping out on him, or a pair of young lovers who were conspiring to get around a father who objected to them getting married. But they had very stock characters, and the way that the character dressed was a very stock look, so that and it was often a very simplified version of the dress that you would see on people in the street, but it had a very standardized approach, so that all of the theater companies essentially had the ability to put on these plays and be viable. And they would tour, and then it came down to who was performing it better as opposed to who was necessarily looking better. They valued the performance over the visual. So they had a much more standardized approach to the visual of drama in that period in Italy and in France, because it bled over into France and became a very popular format. I think it was called Teatro d'Italia in the Parisian society. And yes, you are probably hearing the dogs snoring like a chainsaw in the background. Sorry for that punctuation.
Yes, we definitely are. So she responded, she said, I think Commedia dell'arte would have been much different from the ballets and masquerades with the classical Hercules, Cleopatra, chastity and honor type characterizations.
Ballet, I'm not as familiar with in Italy. I am more familiar with its early iterations in France. And at that, it's definitely post-period for the SCA, because you really see it coming into being in French society in about the 1630s, 40s, are the earliest versions of it, but it really starts to take off in the 1660s and through the 1680s, and then it just explodes from there on out. So to be honest, I would have to do a little bit of digging myself to be familiar with what the tropes of particularly Florentine ballet, and that's also a little bit of a weird point when you move into Italy, because each of the city-states had a very different visual aesthetic that you often would see. Performance troupes would tend to stay within a given city-state's region because everything they had referenced that city-state. And so if the Florentine acting troupe were to go to Venice, they'd look wacky, and the Venetians would not necessarily want to deal with them because it would have a foreign aspect to it. And there was also a lot of competitiveness between the various city-states. Venice looked down on Rome, Rome looked down on Venice. They were jealous of one another continuously, and Florence had a habit of sort of thumbing their nose at both of them because Florence had the bankers. And they said, screw you, we've got the money. So with Italy, you can't necessarily look at it as being quite so homogenous from top to bottom. And I've dug a little bit into Commedia dell'arte in Italy to just familiarize myself with how it started and then cascaded over, but I haven't focused as much on the various regional iterations that it took on within Italy to be able to say specifically what Florence would have interpreted it as in their ballet then interpretation of it.
All right, let's see. What is the starting point of your design process? Do you choose the exemplar or the vision first?
I tend to start with the Shakespeare characters, I started with the character, and I did the old school costume designer trick of just literally going back and reading the text. Is there something in, every actor who portrays a Shakespeare character will tell you Shakespeare gives you everything you need. You just have to rely on the words that he gives you. So I will usually try and find an image, particularly that the character uses themselves. Because if the character is going to use it, it's kind of like when you're watching a movie and one of the characters in the movie uses the movie title, it does that click, that brand recognition thing for the viewer of sort of drawing a nice little design and thematic circle around everything. Cleopatra ended up being more looking at what was going on at the time that Cleopatra was written, and what that play was written in response to, which was the Essex Revolt, or almost revolt, a few years prior, when Elizabeth was still alive, because Cleopatra was presented in the early years of Jane's reign. And so for that one, I then started looking at fantastical portraits of Elizabeth that were very well known at the time, such that if I referenced them, they would be things an Elizabethan audience would likely know. With Titania, it happened to be a reference in the play. She makes reference to one of her priestesses who is from the East, and she keeps referencing that priestess and wanting to protect the child, which is essentially the argument that she and Oberon are having that causes the whole problem of the play. I thought, she's referencing a priestess from the East. I thought it would be interesting if the East, in this instance, was East India. And so I went with a very heavy East Indian influence, and the woman that this is being made for happened to have a lot of saris and East Indian fabric that she had stockpiled in the right colors. And so she sent me those, and most of the fabrics used there are from India and have that exoticism to them. In general, if it's something that I'm making for myself, I think about what story I'm trying to tell with the outfit and how do I make that billboard huge. If it's a character, I try and start with the text and work outward from there. With these, I will say the drawings are a lot more complicated than some of them are going to end up being, because they're black and white line drawings. They don't have color or fabric texture worked into them. And in the case of Cleopatra, there was a whole nother level of detail that I screened out, because as I saw her evolve, it would have muddied the statement if I piled on the next level. So I do give myself that ability. I try and work in the black and white first to put the maximum amount of detail in, and then that gives me the ability to work backward and filter some out as the piece is growing, and hopefully will organically tell me when to say, okay, stop. Hopefully that answers the design question.
That was a great answer. Myself. So I don't see any other questions. If anybody has any other questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. But the last one was just a comment, and I absolutely agree with this. I just want to thank you for encouraging everyone to go for it, create, enjoy, and to share your story. So.
Absolutely. And feel free, if I didn't want to get too technical in terms of sewing mechanics with this. I wanted to talk more concept and design process and the thinking behind them. But if you've got technical questions about how to sew these types of clothing, by all means, come find me on Facebook. I'm happy to answer questions. I've taken photos, and there are some of them in the presentation, of the internal guts of this going together and the various pieces. But I'm happy to help people who are trying to figure out, you know, the mental geometry of how you look at a three-dimensional garment and flatten it out into pattern pieces. That can be intimidating, but I will absolutely say, one, they're a lot simpler than you think they are. And two, I'm happy to help you figure out how you draft one for yourself, because if you have a ruler and you can draw a straight line along that ruler, you can do this. Trust me, it is way simpler than you think it is. Most of this is more about patience than it is about having a super high level of sewing skill. I don't mean that to detract from all of the people who are amazing tailors. Absolutely, there is skill involved, but to do a basic presentation, you absolutely can do it with beginner sewing level skills if you've just got the patience, and that's really more of the key, and not letting it intimidate you. So come find me on Facebook. Happy to answer questions. We can either do a messenger, comments, what have you, but by all means, feel free to pepper me with technical sewing questions that way, because I think it would be easier to convey that type of information in photos with comments than trying to stand and point and jockey a camera for a Zoom call about that sort of thing.
When do you know you're done working on a project? I know some people who have the too much gene. I have that too much. I totally own that. I tend to start with the too much is a good starting point mentality. And that's part of the reason why I try and work in black and white in my initial designs, because I get some of that too much out of my head and onto the paper first. And then it will start to tell me as it's coming together. And I see the colors and how the colors balance themselves against one another.
This actually had more detail associated with it. There was supposed to be little details at the intersection of all the squares. And in looking at it, one, a lot of it would have gotten hidden in the folds of the skirt. And two, it's already visually busy enough. So I tend to not try and rush myself doing these. So I have the time to put it on the mannequin and step back and just sit and look at it for a day or two, look at it in different lighting, and also just let myself walk away from it a little bit, because when you've been up this close to it for a week sewing, your perspective is a little bit skewed. So you need to give yourself a little bit time away to sort of cleanse your visual palette, and then come back and say, okay, how's it working? Is the balance there? Does it need something else to pull it together? Or is it just a matter of deciding what jewelry and accessories would naturally be worn with this, and I can stop sewing things onto it? But that tends to be how I approach it. So there isn't a specific point along the process where it says I'm done. I try and give myself a number of places along the path to reach that point, and sort of give myself permission to say, oh, hey, I know I designed 15 more things, but you know what? This is working as it is. I don't need to push it that step further. Or, oh, well, yeah, it really does need that. But I think it's more important to build in some stopping points and some visual breathe space as you complete a chunk of each of these sorts of projects, to then assess where you are in process before moving on to the next round of detail pile-on.
So we have a couple of questions about the Penzik project. So one of them is just they're hoping that the Penzik project will be filmed, documented for those who can't attend. And the other question is, you mentioned a project for Penzik. Is there anything the general populace could create or wear that will support that spectacle?
As to filming, I would assume some amounts of it will get filmed. Quick overview. My encampment does a big party the Saturday night of middle weekend of Penzik. We usually have a theme to that party. Last year at Penzik, a number of us throughout the whole first week when we were socializing kept noticing that we would reference in our jokes and geeking out conversations our love of both the movie and the game Clue. And so when we were trying to think of a theme for the party, we naturally gravitated toward that because of all the conversations we've been having, and tried to come up with a way of how do we use Clue but put it in a context that references the SCA. And initially, what we tried to plug historical figures into the roles of Miss Scarlet, Colonel Mustard, Professor Plum, what have you. And very quickly, we could find historical figures that we thought would be interesting, but the problem that everyone kept coming up with was, well, why would they all be together? And that very quickly was like, okay, everyone's overthinking this too much. If that mechanic is getting in the way of just being able to go along with the fun, we're not going to go with historical figures. Personally, I have always been enamored of plays like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, or, and my favorite is Desdemona, The Story of the Handkerchief, where a writer looks at what the Shakespeare characters do when they're not on stage. Because there are always a number of players who spend huge chunks of time not in front of the audience. And it occurred to me, what would happen if we could get a whole bunch of Shakespeare characters in one room together, kind of like a big group of dysfunctional siblings, all competing for daddy's favor. And immediately when we thought of that, Shakespeare characters started clicking in to the different character parts, and we were like, okay, that's it. We're gonna amass a collection of Shakespeare characters that we think it would be fun to stick in a space together and make them interact with one another as competitive siblings, essentially, with Shakespeare as dad. And that became the format. So the characters will have a space in the party that is specifically theirs, and it will be color themed along with their clothing. We are composing food and beverage to go with. In some cases, there will actually be performance. And there will be some filmed aspects because once the party is over, there is going to be an online component that people can go watch because we wanted to somehow mimic the way that the movie ends with 3 different endings. Here's what happened, or here's the other alternative version, but here's what really happened, the way that the Clue movie ends. So we wanted to kind of spoof that, but it's not going, that is going to be an online component. I'm sure some amount of it will get filmed, and we're talking about how we want to potentially handle that, but filming is always a little bit dicey, and particularly given that it's going to be in the evening and it's flickery torchlight, it might be something that is more photographic than entirely filmed. Can people dress to support it? Absolutely. You know, we're going to encourage everyone in your own persona, if you want to pick one of the Clue characters to emulate or dress entirely in a color in your period, that would be a great amount of fun. Or just come to the party in your best party clothes. Either one works. But we want it to be not just about performance. It's going to, we're calling it sort of a sensory club because we're going to try and play on people's sense of smell, their taste through food and beverage. There will be music and performance and visual spectacle. So it's an all over full immersive type of experience for the party.
That sounds amazing, and I really want to go. I'll just I don't have any other real questions, but I figure I'd end with this one. You might have a thought on this too. Someone says, as a modern world actor who performs and adores Shakespeare, I've truly enjoyed this. Conveying information via costuming in his shows is so necessary and interesting. And I still don't know how they performed unabridged versions of his shows in under 2 hours.
One of the things that I think is good to look at is old school, like film and video of opera from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when they weren't, modern opera tries to convey emotion more, and not to say that they stint on musical quality of the performers, absolutely they don't, but they try and get singers who are more visually emotive and who can be more physically active while being able to sing at that level, so that they can incorporate more realistic action into an opera. But when you look at the old 40s, 50s, and 60s operas, they were very much standing in place, firing off the musical performance, and that was all they cared about. It wasn't, you know, they were in a costume and there was a big old set behind them, but the performer themselves was doing nothing about being super emotive and creating a physicality for the character. And I tend to think that Shakespeare's plays in period probably had an aspect of that, because they didn't have time to be all gestury and physical. A lot of it was going to be come out, hit your mark in terms of where you have to be to convey the sound for best effect, and get those lines out there and make sure you're projecting enough that the person who is in the scene with you can hear you, but you're also both balancing each other out, because Shakespeare is notorious for having, if you look at the page, the way that the text is broken up, the iambic pentameter breaks such that one character is starting a thought and the other character thematically completes it, even though they are not in character consciously doing that. So they have to be able to hear and project at the same level, but they're spitting it out at top speed. So I think a lot of it was mostly about having specific points on that thrust stage where they were going to be standing when they delivered certain speeches, or how they were aiming themselves, and less about emotion. The only time I would say that's probably a flipped paradigm is in the instances where you have fight sequences, because those would have been choreographed, and however they were conveying the stabbing and the stage blood and what have you, that would necessitate a slightly different approach. But otherwise, my suspicion is they were probably doing a much more stiff presentation that relied more on vocal acrobatics than it did in terms of physicality and creating. So, having a Cleopatra outfit like that, where you are standing still and you've got, you're wearing a character billboard, helps you do that, because you're not getting to do quite as much emotively in terms of your physicality if you're keeping to that time constraint.
That makes sense. So I don't have any additional questions for you.
Well, as I said, by all means, come find me on Facebook if we're not friended already and you've got questions about sewing mechanics, design mechanics. I'm happy to geek out more about the conceptual aspects as well, but hopefully that's enough to whet people's appetites and get them started thinking about how they can start telling stories with their own clothing and how they present their persona. And when we all get back together again in big groups, I hope to see a lot of really fun storytelling outfits that we can geek out about together.